Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Stack, where today I'm thrilled to be sitting down with debut novelist Alejandro Heredia for his beautiful new book, Loca. A little bit about Alejandro. He is a queer Afro-Dominican writer from the Bronx. He has received fellowships from LAMBDA Literary, VONA, the Dominican Studies Institute, Kenyon Review, and Trinity College. In 2019, he was selected by Miriam Gerba as the winner of the Gold Line Press Fiction Chapbook Contest. His chapbook of short stories, You're the Only Friend I Need, explores themes of queer transnationalism, friendship, and unbelonging to the African diaspora. Heredia's work has been featured in Teen Vogue, LAMBDA Literary Review, The Offing, and elsewhere. He received an MFA in fiction from Hunter College. Heredia currently serves as Black Mountain Institute's Shearing Fellow at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So enjoy this episode of Behind the Stack. I'm really thrilled today to be sitting down with Alejandro Heredia for his debut novel, Loca, which is just beautiful. Also, this is such a stunning cover. They did such an amazing job on it. It's really just beautiful. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Brett. I'm excited to be here.
So before we start talking about the book, I had some questions about you that I'm just so curious about. So your parents were immigrants, correct?
That's right.
Okay, and were you born in the States?
I was born in the Dominican Republic,
Okay.
and I moved to the Bronx when I was 7 years old. So I remember very consciously what it was like to move to a new country, learn a new language, all of that stuff. I came to New York specifically in 2001, like a week and a half after 9/11. So
Wow.
yeah.
Wow, what a time to come. Do you have many memories of your time in the Dominican Republic as a child?
I do, yes. I remember my upbringing. I mean, I had friends there. I lived with my grandparents because my parents were here in the United States. They came to this country when I was like a couple months old, I think less than 1 year old. And so I grew up with my grandparents, my cousin, and my older brother. We all grew up in the same house. Yeah, I remember going to school. I remember hanging out with the boys outside, playing baseball, getting into all kinds of trouble. I remember it all vividly. We had a mango tree in the backyard. So yeah.
Now, are your parents in the Bronx now as well?
My mom is in the Bronx.
Okay.
My dad lives in Jersey. My
Okay.
mom is in the Bronx. My grandparents are in the Bronx. Most of my family still lives in the Bronx. Yeah.
Okay, and you just have the one brother?
No, so I have an older brother. I have two younger brothers and a younger sister. So I have quite a few siblings. Yeah, yeah.
That's a big family.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Any other writers?
No. Oh my God, no. There are no other writers in my family. When I remember growing up and I started reading books here in the US, when I started reading books, people would look at me like I had two heads. They were like, "What are you doing? Reading books? You should be out talking to girls or whatever." And that turned out to be not an interest of mine for many reasons, not just books, but yeah, no, I'm definitely the first writer in the family.
So this is a big deal. This publication.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's funny, I just texted my cousins this morning because I'm trying to coordinate getting my mom to the launch party. My mom understands that I have a book coming out, but I don't know that it means the same thing to me as it does for my family per se. They just have a different understanding of it, even though they're very, very supportive of the book coming out and of me being a writer. I think they're kind of confused about what it is that I do all day. They're like, you don't have a job. Yeah.
I remember because I was an actor before I started as a casting director, and my mom I'd always get these questions, the same thing. They really didn't understand it or how it worked or even auditioning.
Yeah.
And I remember my mom used to say things to me like, "Why don't you just go do a commercial?" And I was like, "Okay, well, let me call those people and tell them I'm ready."
Yes. And my partner's dad just gave me a motivational speech the other day, and he was like, you need to just call Oprah. Just call Oprah, let her know that you have a book coming out. And I was like, yeah, I forgot. I did not think about that. Yes.
Let me pull her up on speed dial to say, hey, I am so ready.
Girl, I know you're waiting.
Right. So wait, you as a kid, you originally were not into reading, correct?
I was not into reading. No, I hated reading. I thought it was very boring. And then something clicked in seventh grade. I started reading, and then I just could not stop. So
What was the entry book for you? What do you remember?
yes, it was a children's book called Ink Heart. And
Oh my God, I know it well.
yeah, Ink Heart is,
But you, of course, explain it if you could explain it for our
yeah,
listeners and viewers. Yes.
it's a novel. I mean, I'll try to summarize it. It's a novel about this father and daughter, and I believe they both have this ability that gives them the power to bring to life whatever they read out loud from a book.
That's right.
And it's a book series that really focuses on the power of storytelling and words and characters and how people can really relate to people to books when the characters come alive, quite literally. So it was quite an interesting first book to really bring me into the world of books, because it's a book all about the the power of books and words.
Yeah, it's such a great series. I think they ended up making a movie out of the first one. I want to believe that they did with,
Yes,
was it Brendan Fraser was the dad?
he was. Yes,
Is that right?
that's right.
Wow, see, that's so crazy. But yeah, I love that series. It's one of those things where I remember reading that and thinking there's such a rich there's such a rich world with young adult novels that sometimes people overlook, I think, because they think, oh, they're young adult, and yet some of them are so sophisticated and play on so many different levels that that one in particular, that series in particular, is so like wonderful and magical.
Yeah, and I think it's important to give those folks their credit. You know, obviously later on, I went on to fall in love with literary fiction, but before then, I was reading young adult novels. I was reading novels and books for young people like me, and that was really my entryway.
So then what led you, how did you get into writing?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly when I made the transition from reading intensely to wanting to write. I remember the first piece of fiction that I wrote. It was for a history class. A teacher had us write about a fictional take on the first contact between Europeans and Native Americans. Like what?
Oh, wow.
So we were supposed to sort of imagine a sort of first contact story. And so it was supposed to be one page. It was assigned from one day to another. Come back the next day with a page of what you imagine this thing was like. And I ended up writing that night like 14 pages. And I turned it in to my teacher, and he was like, "Are you okay? Why did you write all of this?" But I think that was the first moment where I thought, "Oh, that was interesting." I actually liked imagining this world. Obviously, I was writing about something that was quite devastating, but still, it was interesting and useful for me to sort of write a scene, write character, write a story. And then from then on, I think at the end of, I always forget about this, but at the end of high school, I did, and I don't know if this is still around, but NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month. Have you heard of this?
I've not heard of that.
It's a crazy thing that people do where they sign up for this competition of sorts where the goal is to write a novel in a month.
Oh, wow.
And you get a little like digital certificate at the end. But really it's to feel good about yourself. I did that in like senior year of high school or junior year or something. And that was fun. And I did that for me just because I found it pleasurable.
Did you print your digital certificate?
I did not. No, I didn't have a printer at home. So I just kind of let it disappear.
That's awesome. So for our listeners, for our viewers, do you have an elevator pitch for the book or kind of a summary that you could share?
Yeah. Elevator pitch, Loca is a novel about two best friends, Sal and Charo, who are trying and failing miserably to build a new life for themselves in the Bronx in 1999. It's a story about immigration, queerness, and I think ultimately a story about responsibility, the kind of responsibilities that we have to ourselves, and just as importantly, the kinds of responsibility that we have to our community.
I have to read some of these blurbs that you've gotten for the book from like some of my favorite writers, and it's really, really impressive. It's Adam Hazlitt says the most generously written novel I have read in a very long time, and that generosity is a beautiful thing. Then Loca asks, how do we find each other and love each other, see each other, save each other? And this novel answers again and again like this. And that was from Alexander Chi, who I'm just obsessed with. And then Ramana Lam has said, a queer book, yes. A Dominican book, too. A Spanglish book, sure. And as such, a quintessentially American novel, a beautiful one. I mean, you are just like racking them in, like incredible. I just was like, wow. Congrats just on those and the response that you've been having. It's really amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm, it is a privilege to be read at all, and it is an even bigger privilege to be read with so much generosity and intelligence. So I'm incredibly grateful.
I'm curious, what led you to the decision of setting the book in 1999, aside from it's a great Prince song?
Yes, that is a great Prince song. I really wanted to write a story about my parents' generation of immigrants. My parents immigrated to the Bronx in the mid '90s, and they were in the Bronx from then on. And I really wanted to capture that world, the kinds of relationships that people had, the kinds of buildings that they lived in, the kind of environments, and the block. I write a lot about Grand Concourse and 170. Because that's where I grew up, but that's also where that was my parents' home when they first arrived in New York. And so I really just, it came out of, like a lot of this novel, it came out of a desire to just like freeze in amber this world that I know won't be there forever, that already has changed a lot in the past 20 years.
Did you find any of it a challenge, or was it more liberating in a way?
It was pretty liberating. It wasn't challenging because I came to this country in 2001, and between 1999 and 2001, there's not a lot that's different. So I knew a lot about the world already through my own experience, but I had also heard a lot about it through my mom. My mom is a big storyteller. She loved to tell stories about her immigration experience. And she had always shared with me, all the trials and tribulations that she had experienced when she first arrived in the Bronx. And so I already sort of had an internal database to pull from. So it wasn't very challenging in that way.
Was there anyone in the queer community that you were able to pick their brain?
Yes. I asked a few people, but my main source of information was William Johnson, I see him as a mentor of mine. He currently works at Pan America. That's where we met, because I used to work there a couple years ago. And while I was writing the novel, I think I already had a draft of it in there, but while I was revising, I would ask William a lot of questions about like queer New York City life in the 1990s. And one of the things that he taught me, which to me should have been obvious, but that I just didn't know because I hadn't experienced. And he taught me that there were queer things happening in the Bronx in the 90s. There was actually a club that was open that I think closed in like 2006 or 2007. I forget the name that he used to go to, and so it sort of reoriented a lot of my vision for the novel and helped me focus some of the queer party scenes that happen in the novel in the Bronx. Some of it does happen in Manhattan in sort of traditionally queer spaces like the Village, but Vance, for example, he has, his house parties in the Bronx, and that's for the queer people. So it was really important for me to have mentorship in that way, because I did not live through that at that time.
Sure. As you said in the beginning, it really follows these two characters who follow kind of, they have divergent paths in some ways about their own experiences being two different immigrants in the Bronx, both of them kind of looking for their sense of identity, how they fit, how they forge their own paths. Did you know in construction that you wanted to kind of make these two separate stories? Because they come back together, certainly, and they're always kind of tethered together, but they are very two distinct narratives.
Yeah, I knew that I wanted to write a novel about friendship from the beginning. And so it was always clear to me that the novel had to be about Sal and Shadow and that they needed to have their own thing going on as best friends often do, as friends often do. But I didn't always have an idea of what the structure of the novel would be like. And that was something that I struggled with quite a bit. At the beginning, the novel seemed to focus a lot on Sal, and the novel was structured very differently. And then through the editorial process, I was able to move some things around. I added those extra scenes of Chadow's past, which I think really rounded out her character and allowed us to understand where she's coming from, her own immigration story, and the kinds of her past and how that informs the choices that she makes in the novel, because she makes some pretty, I think, severe choices throughout the book.
Yeah.
So it took some time to find some footing with her character, but I think from the feedback that I'm getting, some people seem to like her more than they like Sal.
Yeah, and I'm not giving anything away, but I understand some of that in a way
Yes.
because her choices feel, I don't want to say logical, but I'm also thinking about it as somebody who's coming at it in 2025 and
Yes.
looking at these choices versus 1999. And so I think that informs things as well. I do want to start with Sal a little bit. You talk about he's an immigrant, he's a gay immigrant. The specificity, and this is kind of somewhat from your text, the specificity of being Dominican and that difference from, say, Mexicans or Central Americans. Are these conversations you've had that he's had in your own mind? Are these things that come up for you? And did you find any of your own journey in regards to your sexuality and acceptance of who you are informed who Sal was?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure in some ways some of me seeped into some of the questions that Sal's asking himself around his queerness. I mean, we have different experiences. I immigrated to New York when I was 7, and so in so many ways, I'm just a very American person. And Sal immigrated when he was 19 years old, and I think it's different when you are almost a fully formed adult, and then coming to a new country. Your relationship to the other country, your relationship to the new country, all of that is quite different than my own experience. But certainly, there were some questions that I had about my own experience in my own life that I was sort of teasing out through that character and through that character's experiences. I was particularly interested in this question that a lot of immigrants are told about hard work. That section that you just read about from the novel is Sal asking himself, or saying to himself, I was told this story by my mother that if I worked very, very hard, things would kind of just open up before me and I would be fine in this country. But I'm being introduced and being challenged to think about my story in all these different ways. And it's getting really hard to figure it out because the story is more complicated than I thought it was. To me, that was really important to write. And I think some people might see that as me sort of tackling what people call intersectionality. That's like the word that's the hot button word that's used.
Yes.
That's the word that is being used to describe my book, I think, in early reviews. But that's not what I was trying to do there. I was trying to make a point about storytelling and the fact that we all tell each other and ourselves stories about our lives. And the more that we live, the more that hopefully life will challenge those stories and complicate those stories.
Yeah, and I don't view it as much about intersectionality as I do just identity in general and finding yourself.
Yeah.
And that time in a young person's life, which everyone goes through, which they're trying to figure out who I am, where I fit in my family, in my community, in my work life. What am I going to be? Where am I going to go? It's a time of like great opportunity, but it's also a time of huge introspection and growth, I think. You'll have to help me with the pronunciation of this name. Is it Yadiel?
Yes, Yadiel, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yadiel is a great character in the book who is the boyhood friend of Sal's. He grows up with him. He lives life very largely. He's flamboyant. He very much lives on the edge. Where did the inspiration for this character come from? I thought he was such an interesting character and a great catalyst, obviously, for so much of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think the inspiration for Yadiel, I think this character came out of seeing in my own life people who express their queerness with such little trepidation, with so much bravery, with so little care for what people on the bus might think, people on the train might think, people at the park might think, whatever. I was not that person. I was as a teenager, as a young adult, I was very hypervigilant, very afraid, very anxious. But I was always very inspired by people who were not like me in that way. So I wanted to write a different interpretation of or a different version of queerness than my own in this character, just based on reality, on people that I've known in my life, including my cousin Junior, who I dedicated the book to. He was somebody who just did not care and was quote unquote, flamboyant or very expressively queer everywhere he went, and did not really stop himself from expressing himself.
Yeah, I love that. But I also, it's an interesting thing too, because it's also a generational thing. I think sometimes because I look at so many young people now, and this book spoke to me so much in terms of, like, I look at my son he's 21, and just the views and the way that he is with his friends and their views about sexuality and gender. It's all, it's so much more accepting and so much more not a big deal with everyone. It's just, you are who you are, and this is what, we're going through, and which I think is so incredibly amazing. And it's obviously why, so much of what's currently happening in the country is heartbreaking. And I think it speaks to what this book talks about, which is family and the power of community, and why it's so important right now that we all double down and be there for each other. So, Sal goes to an astrologist at one point named West because he's feeling lost. And I wanted to read just this little bit about this, which the astrologist says to him: for some people, it's astrology, church, drugs. It's fine if God is dead and all that, but we need something between us and the world. For our people, it's always been each other. And our people, Sal says, like he's savoring new words. Who are your people? That's the thing to ask yourself. I loved that so much because, there's this whole, like we said, conversation about family and community. But at the end of the day, I love that term, our people, because I know I've used that a lot, our people, and who are your people? And even to say very casually, they're not my people, or when you understand that. And I just think that's such a great thing, because I think sometimes the word family or the same word community limits the boundaries of what that can actually mean.
Yeah.
And I think it's confining. Do you agree?
Yeah. I mean, I think as a writer, I'm in the business of being really rigorous about language and about trying to push the way that I'm using language and the way that I'm hearing language being used in the culture. I come from a community organizing background. And so what I did for 10, 12 years in college, after I graduated college, in a professional setting. And so I believe deeply in community organizing. And I also see the ways in which even that word community has been co-opted by forces who are not actually interested in community, who are not actually interested in collectivity. They're interested in your pocket and in your attention, and in how much profit they can make off of you. And so I feel sometimes the same way about the language of chosen family. Why do we need to replicate the sort of the biological family, sort of figure out how we might belong beyond the traditional family setting? And so that's sort of the language that I landed on, in the novel, this language of who are your people. And then, not only the novel doesn't just ask who are your people, it also asks how are you responsible to your people? How do you show up to your people? Are your people the people who you get along with all the time? Can you disagree with your people? Can you have a falling
Right.
out? Can you have an argument? Can you fail the people that you love? And can you try to atone for said failures? These are all these questions that I wanted to ask and explore throughout the novel, that I think both Sal and Charo are asking themselves in very different ways. Sal's asking himself this question in light of great tragedy that he experienced in the Dominican Republic before he migrated. And Charo's trying to figure it out because she has a daughter that she's responsible to, that she loves deeply, all the while feeling estranged and oppressed by the domestic responsibilities that are expected of her just because she's a young woman.
Yeah, and those kind of, for lack of a better, like kind of those gendered stereotypes of what she should be and what she should do. She's incredibly brave, and I think both these characters are fighting very much against loneliness and feeling isolation in different ways, even in the midst of being surrounded by people who are familiar to them, or and that I think is such a very real thing. Yeah. Who did you start with? Who was the first? Which character to you came first?
So the novel began in my mind with Sal and Charo speaking to each other. So I think that's maybe why the novel sort of came out the way that it did ultimately, about being about both of them. I can't remember what that scene ended up being that I sort of first imagined. But I often, when I think of a character, it's usually through hearing them talking. Sometimes in conversation with others, sometimes like an inner monologue, whatever they might say to themselves. And with this novel, it was Sal and Charo talking to each other. So they kind of came at the same time.
Interesting. And as you're writing and hearing that, how does that process work for you? Do you kind of spitball? Do you kind of just let them speak through you and write? How does that come out?
So it's a lot of notes. I have a lot of notes on my phone. When I'm on the bus, when I'm out of the shower, when I'm doing dishes, whatever, things will just come to me, and then I just have to write it down. So much of writing for me comes out of daydreaming, which means that I have to give my brain leisure time, which means that I need to, put down the podcast and put down the television show or put down the YouTube video or whatever, or social media, whatever it is, to allow my brain to kind of wander and do its own thing. So it's a lot of notes at the beginning, a lot of fragmented things, but really so much of writing I figure out while I'm doing it. I don't always know where I'm going. I don't always know how things are going to end up or how a character is going to be until I'm literally sitting in front of my computer writing down the scene or writing down the dialogue.
Love that. It's almost like, in a way, it's almost improvisational.
Yes. Yeah, it feels that way. Yeah, it feels that way. And then, that's the first draft. After that, you start.
Right.
I spent 5 years revising this novel. And so after, I think 7-8 months of writing the first draft. So
wow.
It's a lot of the work comes after, but at least in the first draft, it really is about improvising and following one's instincts.
Now, was Charo is inspired by anyone in your life?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there were questions that I had about my mother's experience and about the experiences of women like my mother, like my aunts, and cousins, maybe women who came to this country in the late 80s, early 90s, who came to this country and lived very lonely lives. I was curious because, and I think this was my mom's experience at the beginning. I mean, my mom her sister was here. She had a few cousins. But I think my mom felt really lonely when she first got here, the first few years. And Charo's story was inspired by the question, well, what if my mom or women like my mother would have had friends, a group of friends, to get her through the challenges of being a young mother, of being a young immigrant, of exploring all these personal and existential questions that come up.
Interesting. One of the things in the book that I loved so much, it's actually a twofold thing. And I don't know if really there's a question in here, but I love the community, the family, their people that you create. And especially in terms of gender identity, which at the time didn't have names for what we know now.
Yes.
But what I loved so much is the way that you introduced not just these characters, but ancillary ones like Amy, for example. And the way you did it is it's almost gender colorblind, where you're reading about these people and then something gets revealed later on that tells you who they are in terms of a sense of some sort of identity. And I loved that so much. Well, it's so effective because it's bringing you into something that it doesn't matter, right? You're just attached to the person. So it kind of eliminates anything else that you might immediately attach to it at first. I think it's beautiful and great that you did that.
Yeah, no, thank you for noticing that. That is something that I did very intentionally with different characters. I did it with Ella, I did it with Amy, I did it, with a few characters here and there. I don't want to misquote Morrison, but I remember reading an interview of hers talking specifically about introducing characters and when you say the race of the character and when you don't say the race of the character. And I remember her saying something along the lines of, and I'm summarizing here, when you say the race of the character, you say both everything and you also say nothing, right? You might say everything about, racial background and where they're coming from, etc., all the sort of surface things. But when you say this character is Dominican, or you say this character is Black American, and when you say whatever ethnicity the character is, it's also not saying anything about this person's specificity, right? And that's sort of what I was trying to play with a little bit, allowing the reader to sort of engage with the character before knowing that they're not the specific gender that they think the character is, or the specific race that they think the character is. No, I want you to experience the character for who she is. And then later on, if it becomes relevant, then it becomes relevant, right? It's kind of, it's fucking with the reader a little bit, but I think we can all learn, including myself, to detach ourselves a little bit from this obsession with identity that we have in our contemporary moment.
Yeah, and it's done so beautifully. So this is just a side note. I was just curious because, again, with the book in 1999, and obviously you didn't live through that, but I'm just so curious what you thought. Did you find that our current means of communication makes it easier to foster relationships or more challenging ultimately?
I think a little bit of both. I think it makes connection, especially surface connection, easier. So I can connect with people across the country, anytime of the day, across the world, anytime, any day. But I think, I don't know, sometimes this is maybe the millennial in me. I'm sure the Gen Zs would roll their eyes. It probably makes us take each other for granted a little bit. It makes us believe that we know what's going on in people's lives because we see what they're posting on social media. When in fact, if you follow me on social media and you see what I post, you have no idea who I am. That's a construction that I am putting online. And even for the people that I'm consciously doing that, and I'm consciously saying that, even for the people that believe that they're showing their true selves on social media, that's a construction, right? Made for the public and for public consumption. And so, I don't know, it's great potentials, but of course the trouble, to me, the trouble isn't necessarily even that we do this social media stuff and this mass connection all the time in a way that is exhausting, although that's a part of it. The troubling part is that we are being manipulated by algorithms and by people who are using our brains to make money.
100%. It all comes down to capitalism, right? It really is. And it's funny how so much of it is under that umbrella and how it tethers everything. So is to the extreme. And we're seeing it play out now in like Technicolor 4D in our faces in ways that, as we're embarked on this oligarchy, it's terrifying.
I mean, and it's also I think the frustrating part to me is that people who want to do good and want to stay engaged believe that in order to do good and to stay engaged, that they have to be attached to these things all the time. I remember even talking to my students last year. I asked them about social media, what their relationship is to social media. And they were saying, this causes me debilitating anxiety and it makes me feel terrible about myself. But I will also feel terrible about myself if I'm not staying engaged to what's happening around the country and with politics and what's happening around the world. And, I, in my kindest way, I tried to tell them you don't need to be attached to the news or to social media 24/7 to be engaged. But it's the catch-22 of our contemporary moment, I think.
Yeah, no, it's hard. If I was single now, I would probably be single for forever because I could never get on board or figure out, or like just the way my daughter is trying to describe to me dating now. And I'm this is so foreign. Like, why can't you say that you're dating someone? And she's like, well, no, you're not exclusive and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, this is so confusing.
No, it's the wild, wild west out there. It's crazy.
Yeah, it really is. Well, Alejandro, this was such a delight. I'm so happy for you. The book is just beautiful. Congratulations. It's really terrific. So I really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thank you for your generous reading of the novel, your questions. I feel like I'm learning more about the book as I was hearing your questions. So thank you.